There are moments that divide a life into before and after, and Eleanor Ashworth had learned to mark hers by the precise instant her heart had shattered on a ballroom floor. She sat now in the fading afternoon light of their modest parlour, a needle moving through worn kid leather with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to mend what once would have been discarded without thought, and she allowed herself to remember what she usually forbade her mind to revisit. The scent of wilting flowers drifted from a small vase on the window-sill, roses past their prime that she had purchased for a few pennies from a street vendor, because she could not bear a home without some living beauty, though their fading sweetness served only to remind her of the hothouse blooms that had perfumed the midsummer ball 3 years ago, when she had still believed herself loved. She had worn white that night, a gown of silk and tulle that had made her feel like a creature from a dream, and Edmund Hartley had looked at her as though she were the only woman in the room, his golden hair gleaming in the candlelight, his blue eyes sparkling with what she had foolishly believed was genuine adoration. They had danced 2 waltzes, and during the second he had whispered that he intended to speak with her father before the week was out, that she should prepare herself for a question that would change her life forever. She had floated through the next hour in a haze of joy, so complete it had felt almost holy. And then the whispers had begun, spreading through the ballroom like poison through water, and she had watched Edmund's face change as the news of her father's financial ruin reached his ears. He had stopped mid-waltz, stepped back from her as though she carried plague, and announced loudly enough for 50 guests to hear that he was afraid there had been a misunderstanding, that he could never attach himself to a family in such reduced circumstances. And surely she had not thought his attentions were serious. The laughter of the onlookers had been a physical thing, a weight pressing against her chest, and the walk across that endless ballroom floor alone, with every eye upon her and pity or malice in equal measure on every face, had been the longest journey of her life. She had vowed that night, standing in her chamber with the ruins of her dreams scattered around her like the petals of a crushed flower, that she would never again be foolish enough to believe in love, that safety would be enough, that respect would be enough, that she would not reach for more and have her hand slapped away. Her fingers rose now, unconsciously, to the hollow of her throat, where her mother's locket had once hung. The locket she had sold 6 months ago to pay the last of her father's most pressing debts, and she felt the familiar ache of its absence like a wound that would not heal. The parlour door opened, and her father entered, his frame stooped with guilt and age, an envelope trembling slightly in his thin fingers. "My dear girl," Thomas Ashworth said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years of apology, "I have received an invitation to the Pemberton Spring Ball, sponsored by your cousin Harriet, and I confess I do not know whether to consider it a kindness or a cruelty." Eleanor set down her mending and rose to take the envelope from his hands, her grey-green eyes scanning the elegant script, and though her heart contracted with dread at the thought of returning to the world that had witnessed her humiliation, she summoned a smile for the father who had already suffered so much for his mistakes. "It is an opportunity, Papa," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "And we are not in a position to refuse opportunities, however uncomfortable they may prove." She did not add that the thought of entering another ballroom, of facing the whispers and the stares, and the memory of Edmund's cruel dismissal, made her want to retreat to her chamber and never emerge, for her father's guilt was burden enough without adding her own terror to his shoulders, and so she simply pressed a kiss to his weathered cheek and promised that she would write to accept before the evening post. The Pemberton Spring Ball glittered with 1,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers, and Eleanor Ashworth stood at the entrance to the grand ballroom, with her father's arm trembling beneath her gloved fingers, her modest gown of dove-grey silk a quiet statement of dignity rather than defeat. Her chestnut hair pinned in an elegant chignon that revealed the graceful column of her neck, and she drew a breath that felt like swallowing glass as she prepared to enter the world that had cast her out 3 years before. The whispers began before she had taken 10 steps into the room, a susurrus of speculation and memory that followed her like a shadow, and she felt the weight of every curious glance, every raised fan concealing murmured commentary, every pair of eyes that remembered the girl in white who had been abandoned on a dance floor and wondered what desperation had driven her to return. She kept her shoulders straight and her chin level, the posture of a woman who refused to be pitied, though her hand rose unconsciously to the hollow of her throat where her mother's locket should have hung, finding only bare skin and the rapid flutter of her pulse beneath her fingertips. The ballroom was warm, too warm, the press of bodies and the heat of countless candles creating an atmosphere that felt thick and difficult to breathe. And through the tall windows she could see clouds gathering on the horizon, dark masses that promised a storm before the night was through. She had accepted a glass of lemonade and positioned herself near a potted palm with her father when she saw him approaching, Edmund Hartley, his golden hair still artfully styled, his blue eyes still sparkling with that charm that never quite reached their depths, and on his arm walked Viola, the heiress he had chosen over love, her beauty brittle and her smile sharp as broken glass. "Miss Ashworth," Edmund said, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the ears of those nearby, "what an unexpected pleasure to see you venturing out again, though I confess I am surprised your circumstances allow for such entertainments. Or has your situation improved since last we spoke?" Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, felt the echo of that long-ago humiliation rising in her chest like bile, but she summoned every ounce of dignity her mother had taught her, and met his gaze with steady, grey-green eyes. "I thank you for your concern, Lord Hartley," she replied, her voice quiet but clear, "though I find I require very little to be content, a blessing you might not understand." Something flickered in his expression, irritation perhaps at her refusal to crumble, and Viola laughed, a sound like crystal cracking. But Eleanor barely heard it because the room had begun to spin, the heat pressing against her like a living thing, the memories of that other ballroom overlapping with this one until she could not tell past from present, and thunder cracked outside the windows like the sound of her heart breaking all over again. Her hand flew to her throat, grasping for comfort that was not there, and she felt herself falling, the faces around her blurring into a wash of colour and light, but before she could strike the floor, strong arms caught her, one hand cradling her head with surprising gentleness, and she was enveloped in a scent she had never known before. Sandalwood and cedar, with an undertone of leather, warm and masculine, and somehow safe. She looked up into grey eyes, dark as storm clouds, set in a stern face that seemed carved from granite, and then the darkness claimed her entirely. Eleanor returned to consciousness slowly, as though swimming upward through dark water toward a distant light, and the first thing she became aware of was the scent that had accompanied her into oblivion, that warm masculine fragrance of sandalwood and cedar that seemed to wrap around her like a protective cloak, followed by the sharp medicinal bite of smelling salts being waved beneath her nose by a woman's hand adorned with rings that spoke of wealth and consequence. She opened her eyes to find herself lying on a settee in a private sitting room, the sounds of the ball muffled by heavy doors, and standing at the window with his back to her was the tall, broad-shouldered figure of the man who had caught her, his stern profile illuminated by flashes of lightning as the storm she had seen gathering finally unleashed its fury against the windows. "Ah, she wakes," said the woman with the smelling salts, her voice carrying the crisp authority of one accustomed to being obeyed, though not unkindly. And Eleanor turned her head to find a handsome woman of perhaps 60 years, regarding her with sharp, assessing eyes that held more warmth than her tone suggested. "I am Lady Beatrice Blackwell, my dear, and you have given us quite a fright, though I confess my nephew has seen worse on the battlefield, and remained admirably composed." The man at the window turned at this, and Eleanor felt her cheeks flood with mortified heat as she struggled to sit upright, her hand flying instinctively to her bare throat, where her mother's locket should have offered comfort, and finding only the rapid beat of her own humiliation. "Please do not distress yourself, Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice a deep baritone that rumbled like the thunder outside, clipped and formal, yet carrying an undercurrent of something she could not name, and she realized with dawning horror that this was not merely some gentleman who had happened to be nearby when she fell, but the Duke of Thornton himself, one of the most powerful men in England, into whose arms she had collapsed like some vaporous creature from a penny novel. Her father arrived moments later, his face grey with worry, and in the flurry of explanations and reassurances, Eleanor learned the full measure of her mortification when Lady Beatrice mentioned that her nephew's bank held what remained of the Ashworth debts, a detail that made Eleanor wish the settee would simply swallow her whole. "You carry yourself with remarkable dignity, Miss Ashworth," Lady Beatrice observed quietly, pressing a glass of water into Eleanor's trembling hands. "A quality I find increasingly rare and therefore precious." The Duke offered his carriage to see them home through the storm, a courtesy Eleanor wished desperately to refuse, but could not without giving offence. And so she found herself seated across from him in the close confines of his elegant equipage, the rain drumming against the roof like impatient fingers, his scent filling the small space until she could scarcely breathe without drawing him into her lungs. She studied him covertly in the darkness between lightning flashes, noting the hard line of his jaw, the way his scarred right hand clenched into a fist upon his thigh, the careful stillness with which he held himself. And when the lightning illuminated his grey eyes, she discovered them fixed upon her with an intensity that made her fingers twist nervously in her lap, though he looked away the moment he realized she had caught him watching, and neither of them spoke a word for the remainder of the journey home. 3 days passed in a blur of anxious waiting, Eleanor starting at every sound from the street below, telling herself she was not hoping for anything, that the Duke of Thornton had surely forgotten the insignificant woman who had fainted into his arms and inconvenienced his evening. And yet when the knock came on that grey overcast morning, she knew before their single remaining maidservant announced him that it was he, knew it in the way her heart seized, and her hand flew to the hollow of her throat, where comfort should have been. He filled their modest parlour with his presence, his height and breadth making the worn furnishings seem smaller and shabbier than they had ever appeared before, and Eleanor stood frozen beside her father's chair as the Duke of Thornton, in a voice as clipped and formal as she remembered, presented a proposal that stripped the breath from her lungs and the ground from beneath her feet. "I require a wife," he said, his grey eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, as though he could not quite bring himself to meet her gaze. "A woman of good breeding and sensible temperament, who can manage a household and conduct herself with dignity in society. And I find myself in a position to offer you security in exchange for these qualities which you possess in abundance, Miss Ashworth, your father's debts settled, your family provided for, and nothing expected beyond companionship and competence." Eleanor heard the words as though from a great distance, felt them landing against her heart like stones dropped into still water, each one sending ripples of complicated emotion through her chest, relief and humiliation, and the quiet death of dreams she had told herself she no longer harboured, and when she finally found her voice, it emerged steady and quiet despite the trembling of her hands. "I confess I am overwhelmed by your generosity, Your Grace, and I must ask for time to consider such a momentous decision," she said, and she watched his scarred right hand clench into a fist at his side as he inclined his head and granted her request, his expression as unreadable as granite, the scent of sandalwood and cedar reaching her across the small distance between them and making her remember against her will. How safe she had felt in his arms. Her father wept when she told him, torn between guilt at what his failures had wrought and desperate hope that his daughter might yet be saved from the poverty he had created. And Eleanor sat beside him in the grey light that matched her grey acceptance, and reminded herself of the vow she had made 3 years ago, that she would never again be foolish enough to believe in love, that safety was enough, that respect was enough, and here was a man offering both, without demanding the one thing she could not afford to give. The wedding took place with efficient speed in a small chapel, the ceremony brief and sparsely attended, and when he spoke his vows, his voice dropped low enough that only she could hear the words he added to the traditional promises. "I will never give you cause to regret this choice," he said, his grey eyes finally meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You will always have my protection, my respect, and my name. These I can promise. More than this I do not know if I am capable of more." Eleanor's hand rose to her throat as she gave her own vows, reaching for comfort that was not there, and she told herself that what he offered was more than enough, that she was grateful that she would not reach for more and have her hand slapped away, even as something deep within her whispered that she was already beginning to hope. Thornton Hall rose before Eleanor like a stone sentinel against the spring sky, its grey facade softened by the late afternoon sunlight that gilded the countless windows and warmed the ancient walls. And as the carriage rolled to a stop before the grand entrance, she pressed her hand to her throat in that unconscious gesture of seeking comfort, and reminded herself that this magnificent, intimidating place was now her home, though it felt less like a homecoming than an arrival at a beautiful prison whose bars were gilded with duty and arrangement rather than love. The doors opened before she could gather her courage, and a woman of middle years with kind eyes and silver-threaked hair pulled back in a neat arrangement, stepped forward, her hands clasped before her in a manner that spoke of decades of service and quiet authority, and when she spoke her voice carried the warmth that the stone facade lacked. "Welcome to Thornton Hall, Your Grace," Mrs. Clara Hutton said, and Eleanor heard in those simple words a note of cautious hope, as though the housekeeper had been waiting for something or someone to breathe life into these halls. "I have served this house for 30 years, and I confess I have prayed every night for 20 of them that someone would remind him," she added softly, her eyes flickering toward the Duke, who had descended from his own carriage and was approaching with his customary stern expression. And Eleanor did not need to ask what she meant, for she had seen the way Henry Blackwell held himself apart from the world, a fortress unto himself. And she understood now that his household staff saw it too and grieved for it. Lady Beatrice appeared in the doorway, resplendent in afternoon silk, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with evident satisfaction as she watched her nephew offer his arm to his new bride with formal courtesy. "My nephew has been a fortress for 20 years, my dear," she murmured to Eleanor as they passed into the grand entrance hall, her voice pitched low enough that Henry could not hear. "But fortresses, I have observed, make rather lonely homes." The tour that followed was conducted with meticulous formality, Henry explaining the management of the household she would oversee in clipped, efficient sentences that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts, and Eleanor found herself cataloguing details that spoke louder than his careful words. The portrait of a woman with his grey eyes hanging in the gallery, her gentle smile a stark contrast to her son's stern countenance, the books in his study with spines worn soft from repeated reading, the pianoforte in the music room that sat silent beneath a fine layer of dust, as though no one had touched it since the woman in the portrait had gone. It was in the library that everything shifted, that chamber of leather and paper and afternoon. Light where dust motes danced in golden beams streaming through tall windows. And Eleanor, reaching for a volume of poetry on a high shelf, caught her foot on the worn edge of an ancient carpet and stumbled, her heart lurching with the certainty of a graceless fall. but strong hands caught her elbow and steadied her, and suddenly he was close, so close that his scent of sandalwood and cedar enveloped her completely, and she felt his warmth through the thin sleeve of her dress, felt her pulse jump beneath his fingers in a betrayal she could not control. Neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a held breath. And when he finally released her, his scarred right hand closed slowly into a fist at his side, as though he were fighting to contain something he dared not name, and Eleanor stood trembling among the books with her hand pressed to her racing heart, telling herself she would not reach for more, she would not hope, even as hope bloomed treacherously in her chest. In the doorway, unnoticed by either of them, Lady Beatrice watched with knowing eyes and leaned close to Mrs. Hutton, who had followed to ensure the new Duchess wanted for nothing. "Mark my words, Clara," she murmured, her lips curving with satisfaction. "That girl will be the unmaking of all his careful walls, and thank God for it." 2 weeks had passed since Eleanor had become the Duchess of Thornton. 2 weeks of learning the rhythms of a great house that seemed to hold its breath around her. And on this warm afternoon she found herself wandering the estate grounds with a basket over her arm, ostensibly gathering wildflowers for the morning room, but truly seeking to understand the world that was now hers. The tenant cottages with their neat gardens and freshly thatched roofs, the fields where workers tipped their caps to her with curious respect, the winding paths that led through ancient oaks whose leaves filtered the sunlight into patterns of gold and green upon the earth. Mrs. Dawson, the wife of the head groundskeeper, had welcomed her into her cottage for tea, and spoken of the Duke with the careful words of one who wished to be honest without being unkind, saying that his Grace was a fair master, generous with repairs and swift to send the physician when illness struck, that no family on the Thornton estate had ever wanted for necessities, but that he was not one for warmth, not one for lingering to ask after children or remembering names, and Eleanor had nodded and sipped her tea and thought of the man who had caught her when she fell, whose hand had lingered 3 heartbeats too long on her elbow in the library, and wondered which version of him was true. She was walking near the edge of the estate, where the manicured grounds gave way to wilder growth, and a small stream cut through the land, when she heard it, a child's crying, high and frightened and desperate, and her heart clenched as she followed the sound through a thicket of hawthorn until she reached a clearing and stopped, her breath catching in her throat at the scene before her. Henry knelt in the mud beside the stream, his fine riding clothes ruined beyond salvaging, his boots sunk deep in the mire, and before him stood a small boy of perhaps 4 years, tears streaming down his dirty face. And the Duke of Thornton, the man whom society called cold and whom his own tenants described as distant, was speaking in a voice so soft and gentle that Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from making a sound. "There now, you are quite safe. I have you. Can you tell me your name, little one? Your mother must be worried, and we shall find her together," he murmured. And when the child only sobbed harder, he reached out with those large, capable hands, and lifted the boy as though he weighed nothing at all, settling him against his chest with an ease that spoke of instinct rather than practice. Uncaring of the mud that smeared across his waistcoat, his scarred hand cradling the child's head with a tenderness that made Eleanor's eyes burn with unexpected tears. She followed at a distance as he carried the boy toward the tenant cottages, watched as a woman came running with a cry of relief and terror mingled, watched as Henry transferred the child to his mother's arms with quiet reassurance, his voice clipped and formal now as he dismissed her tearful thanks with something approaching discomfort, saying only that the boy was unharmed and that she should see to him, and then he turned to walk away, and Eleanor saw his face in the afternoon light, saw the expression he wore when he thought no one was watching, something unguarded and almost tender, something that looked very much like longing, before it shuttered back behind the familiar mask of stern reserve, and she understood in that moment, with a clarity that shook her to her core, that he was not cold at all, that he had simply learned to be careful, that there was a vast difference between a man who could not feel and a man who had been taught that feeling was dangerous. And as she stood, hidden among the leaves, with her hand pressed to her racing heart, she felt the first true crack form in the defences she had built around herself, the first treacherous whisper that perhaps she had not been wrong to hope after all. The evening of their first formal dinner arrived, with all the weight of expectation pressing upon Eleanor's shoulders like a physical thing, and as she descended the grand staircase in a gown of deep forest green that Mrs. Hutton had insisted brought out the silver in her grey-green eyes, she found her fingers rising to touch the hollow of her throat in that familiar gesture of seeking comfort, though tonight the bare skin there seemed less a reminder of loss than simply a habit she had not yet learned to break. Lady Beatrice intercepted her at the bottom of the stairs, resplendent in burgundy silk, her sharp eyes softening as she took in Eleanor's carefully composed expression and the slight tremor in her gloved hands. "You will be magnificent, my dear," she murmured, squeezing Eleanor's fingers with surprising warmth. "And if Lord Cromwell becomes too insufferable, which he invariably does, simply imagine him as the pompous partridge he so closely resembles, and you will find the evening passes much more pleasantly." Eleanor's startled laugh escaped before she could contain it, and she was still smiling when she entered the drawing-room to find Henry already present, his tall figure commanding in evening black, his grey eyes finding hers immediately with an expression she could not quite decipher, something watchful and intent that made her pulse quicken despite her determination to remain composed. The Cromwells arrived in a flurry of self-importance. Lord Cromwell, a florid man with an impressive waistcoat straining across his considerable middle, and a voice that seemed incapable of modulation below a boom, his wife a faded woman who simpered and agreed with everything her husband said, as though her only purpose was to serve as his echo. Dinner was announced, and Eleanor took her place at the foot of the table with Henry at its head, the candlelight casting warm shadows across the silver and crystal, the scent of roasted pheasant and fresh bread mingling with the delicate fragrance of the hothouse flowers Mrs. Hutton had arranged with such care. And for the first hour she fulfilled her duties admirably, guiding conversation, ensuring glasses were filled, deflecting Lord Cromwell's more outrageous pronouncements with diplomatic murmurs that neither agreed nor offended. It was during the third course that Lord Cromwell launched into an extended account of his hunting prowess, describing in exhaustive detail a stag he had pursued across 3 counties, and as the tale grew increasingly improbable, featuring feats of horsemanship that would have challenged a circus performer, and marksmanship that bordered on the mythological, Eleanor caught Henry's eye across the length of the table, and saw there a flicker of something that looked remarkably like shared suffering. And before she could stop herself, she leaned slightly toward him and murmured, just loud enough for him alone to hear, "I confess, I am uncertain whether Lord Cromwell is describing a hunt or auditioning for a position among the Greek heroes, though I suspect even Odysseus would find his journey home less eventful." The sound that escaped Henry was extraordinary, a laugh that seemed to surprise him as much as anyone, rich and warm and utterly unguarded, transforming his stern features into something almost boyish, as his grey eyes crinkled at the corners and his whole face opened with genuine mirth, and the entire table fell silent as every head turned toward the Duke of Thornton, who had not laughed, truly laughed, in anyone's memory. Lady Beatrice's face bloomed with satisfaction. Lord Cromwell looked bewildered, and Eleanor simply stared, her heart doing something complicated in her chest as she witnessed the man behind the fortress walls, the man who knelt in mud for frightened children and planted camellias for a wife he barely knew, and Henry met her gaze with his smile still lingering. his grey eyes warm as storm clouds breaking into light, and said softly, "Forgive me. I had forgotten I knew how to do that." And for the rest of the evening something had shifted between them, some invisible barrier grown thinner, and when their eyes met across the candlelit table, Eleanor no longer saw a stern stranger, but the beginning of something she dared not name. 5 weeks had passed since Eleanor had spoken her vows in that quiet ceremony. 5 weeks of learning and adjusting and slowly, imperceptibly, becoming something she had not expected to become. And on this beautiful spring morning she sat across from her husband at the breakfast table in the morning room, where sunlight streamed through tall windows and painted golden rectangles upon the polished floor, a cup of tea cooling in her hands as she listened to him describe a dispute between 2 tenant farmers over a boundary stone that had apparently stood in the same location for 3 generations without incident, until one farmer's prize sow had taken to rooting beneath it. "And now," Henry continued, the corner of his mouth twitching in what she had learned to recognize as suppressed amusement, "both men insist the stone has been moved by the other, though neither can explain how a boulder of such considerable size might have been relocated without anyone noticing, and I am expected to render judgment as though I possess some mystical ability to divine the original intentions of their great-grandfathers." Eleanor laughed, the sound coming easily now, in a way it would not have done even 2 weeks ago, and she found herself suggesting that perhaps the sow herself should be called as a witness, given that she seemed to be the only party with intimate knowledge of the stone's foundations, and Henry's grey eyes warmed with that light she had come to watch for, that softening that transformed his stern features into something that made her breath catch in ways she tried very hard not to examine too closely. These morning meals had become a ritual neither of them acknowledged aloud, this quiet hour before the day's duties claimed them, where conversation wandered from estate matters to books they were reading, to memories that surfaced unbidden, and Eleanor had shared more of herself in these sunlit mornings than she had intended, speaking of her mother's garden and her father's library, and the way spring had always felt like a promise when she was young, and Henry listened with that intense attention of his, rarely interrupting, occasionally asking a question that proved he remembered every word she had ever spoken. After breakfast, she found herself drawn to explore the conservatory, that glass-walled paradise she had glimpsed but never properly visited, and as she pushed open the heavy door, the warmth enveloped her like an embrace, humid and fragrant and alive with growing things, and she wandered through banks of orchids and trailing ferns and flowers she could not name, marveling at the abundance until she turned a corner and stopped, her hand flying to her heart as though to contain something that threatened to overflow. White camellias, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, their perfect waxy blooms glowing like captured moonlight in the spring sunshine that poured through the glass above, their scent rising around her in a cloud of memory so powerful that for a moment she was a child again in her mother's garden, watching gentle hands arrange those same blooms in a crystal vase, hearing a beloved voice explain that camellias meant admiration and devotion, and that they had been her grandmother's favorite too. "Beautiful, aren't they, Your Grace?" said a voice behind her, and Eleanor turned to find the head gardener, an elderly man named Mr. Thorne, whose weathered face creased with pleasure at her obvious emotion, and she asked when they had been planted, her voice not quite steady, and Mr. Thorne's answer stole the breath from her lungs entirely. "His Grace ordered them the week after your wedding, Your Grace. Had them brought from London specially, he did. Finest specimens money could buy. Said they were to be perfect for when you found them. Said you would know what they meant." Eleanor stood among the blooms with tears burning in her eyes. Tears she blinked back fiercely, even as her hand pressed harder against her heart, and she remembered mentioning camellias once, just once, in passing, during one of those morning conversations she had thought were merely pleasant. And he had listened, he had remembered. He had said nothing at all, but had quietly filled a conservatory with her mother's flowers and waited for her to discover them. and as the scent of white camellias wrapped around her like an embrace. She felt something shift in her chest, some wall she had built beginning to crumble, and she understood with terrifying clarity that she was in very great danger of falling in love with her husband. 7 weeks into her marriage, Eleanor had grown accustomed to the rhythms of Thornton Hall, to the particular creak of the third stair, and the way moonlight fell through the tall windows of the gallery, and the distant chime of the grandfather clock in the main hall, marking the passage of hours she should have spent sleeping. But on this night sleep would not come, no matter how she turned in her sheets or how firmly she closed her eyes. And so she found herself wandering the darkened corridors in her dressing gown with a candle in her hand, telling herself she was merely restless, merely in need of a book from the library, though her feet carried her past the library door without pausing and toward the east wing, where Henry's private study lay, behind a door of carved oak. And she might have continued past that door, too, had she not noticed the thin ribbon of golden light seeping beneath it, evidence that she was not the only soul in this great house unable to find rest. She hesitated with her hand raised to knock, uncertain whether she had any right to intrude upon his solitude, uncertain what she would even say if he admitted her. But something stronger than propriety compelled her knuckles to rap softly against the wood, and when his voice came low and rough, bidding her enter, she pushed open the door to find him seated in a leather chair before the dying fire, a glass of brandy dangling from his fingers, and his grey eyes fixed upon something small that glinted in his other hand, and the scent that greeted her was warmth itself, sandalwood and cedar mingling with the rich amber of good brandy and the smoke of burning applewood. And when he looked up at her, his expression shifted through surprise, and something that might have been vulnerability, before settling into careful welcome. "I could not sleep," she said softly, and he gestured to the chair across from his, and as she settled into it she saw what he held, a miniature portrait in a golden frame, the painted face of a woman with his grey eyes and a gentle smile. And she remembered noticing a similar portrait during her first tour of the house, remembered wondering about the woman who had borne such a striking resemblance to her stern husband. "My mother," he said, following her gaze, and his voice was rough in a way she had never heard it, stripped of its usual careful control, and when she asked gently if he would tell her about her, something cracked open in his expression, some door he had kept barred for 20 years swinging slowly ajar, and he spoke haltingly of a woman who had laughed often and loved fiercely, and died when he was 12 years old, leaving behind a boy who did not understand why the world had grown so cold, and a father who retreated so far into grief that he forgot he still had a son who needed him. And as Henry spoke of learning that love meant loss, that caring for someone only gave the world a weapon to wound you with, his voice broke on the word alone, and his scarred right hand clenched into a fist so tight his knuckles went white against his thigh, and Eleanor did something she had never dared, something that felt as natural as breathing and as terrifying as stepping off a cliff. She reached across the space between them and laid her hand over his clenched fist, saying nothing, offering no words of comfort because she understood that some griefs were too deep for words, and she simply stayed, her palm warm against his whitened knuckles, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the fire crackling softly and the candles burning low and the great house silent around them, until slowly, so slowly she might have imagined it, his hand uncurled beneath hers, his fingers relaxing, opening, and then turning to lace through her own. And they sat like that in the fire-lit darkness until the candles guttered and died, two people who had both learned to build walls, discovering that some walls were meant to fall. 9 weeks into her marriage, Eleanor had ceased to mark the days as she once had, ceased to count the hours until she might reasonably retire to her chamber and escape the strange new life she had stumbled into, because somewhere between the morning conversations and the evening readings, and the quiet moments that accumulated like snowfall, soft and imperceptible, until suddenly the landscape had transformed entirely. She had stopped wanting to escape at all, and on this golden early summer morning she sat in the library that had become their library, curled in the window seat with a volume of poetry open in her lap. Though she had not turned a page in nearly a quarter hour, her attention instead fixed upon her husband, where he sat at his desk attending to correspondence, watching the way sunlight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, and the way his brow furrowed slightly when he encountered something that displeased him, and the way his mouth softened, almost imperceptibly, when he glanced up and caught her watching. And she looked away quickly, heat rising to her cheeks, but not before she saw the corner of his lips curve upward in what she had learned to recognize as his private smile, the one he seemed to reserve for her alone. Later that morning, he appeared in the doorway of the small sitting-room, where she was reviewing household accounts with Mrs. Hutton, and without preamble he crossed to her and placed something on the table beside her ledger, a length of ribbon, the precise grey-green of a winter sea. And when she looked up at him in surprise, he merely said that he had noticed her old hair ribbons were worn, and that this colour had reminded him of something, though he could not say what. And then he was gone before she could find words to thank him, and Mrs. Hutton's knowing smile made Eleanor's cheeks burn, even as her fingers traced the silk that matched her eyes so exactly it might have been dyed to order, which of course it had been, because he noticed everything and said nothing, and showed his care in ways that bypassed words entirely. And she thought of the camellias blooming in the conservatory, and the book of sonnets that had appeared on her nightstand last week, and the way he always seemed to know when she needed tea or silence or distraction, and her heart performed that peculiar stutter it had developed lately whenever she allowed herself to think too carefully about what all of it might mean. That afternoon they rode together to the village, a duty he had begun including her in these past weeks, and as they walked through the narrow streets with his hand warm and steady at the small of her back, guiding her around puddles and uneven cobblestones, with an attentiveness that seemed as natural to him as breathing, she observed how the villagers responded to them, the genuine warmth in their greetings, the way old Mrs. Caldwell pressed her hand and declared that the Duke had chosen well, the way the blacksmith's wife curtsied with real pleasure and mentioned that his Grace had sent the physician when her youngest had taken ill last month and refused any payment, and Eleanor saw her husband through their eyes, not the cold, stern Duke that society whispered about, but a man who cared deeply and showed it through deed rather than word. And when a small girl with tangled curls broke free from her mother and pressed a fistful of wildflowers into Eleanor's hands, purple clover and white yarrow and yellow buttercups, crushed and wilting, but offered with such earnest joy that Eleanor's throat tightened. She looked up to find Henry watching her with an expression that stole the breath from her lungs, something raw and wondering in those grey eyes that warmed like storm clouds breaking. And she clutched the flowers to her heart without thinking, and watched his gaze follow the gesture, and saw his scarred hand clench once at his side before deliberately relaxing. And neither of them spoke, but something passed between them that felt like a promise. That night, alone in her chamber with the wildflowers pressed in a book, and the grey-green ribbon threaded through her unbound hair, Eleanor stood at her window, watching moonlight silver the gardens below, and finally allowed herself to name the truth she had been running from since that night in his study when his hand had uncurled beneath hers, since the morning she had found a conservatory full of her mother's flowers, since perhaps the very first moment she had opened her eyes to find him watching over her with those fierce grey eyes, and known somehow that she was safe. And the truth was this: she was falling in love with her husband, had perhaps already fallen, was perhaps so deep in love that she could no longer see the surface, and she remembered the vow she had made to herself 3 years ago on a ballroom floor, the promise that she would never again be foolish enough to believe in love, that safety was enough, that respect was enough, that she would not reach for more and have her hand slapped away, and she pressed her palm to the hollow of her throat where her mother's locket had once hung, and understood with terrifying clarity that she had already broken that promise, had shattered it as thoroughly as Edmund Hartley had once shattered her heart. Except this time she had done it to herself. This time she had no one to blame but her own foolish, hopeful heart that had looked at a stern-faced duke with gentle hands and seen something worth believing in. And as she stood there trembling in the moonlight, she did not know whether to weep or laugh, did not know whether this love growing wild and unstoppable in her chest was the greatest gift she had ever received, or simply a new and more exquisite way to be destroyed. 10 weeks into her marriage, Eleanor stood before the gilt-framed mirror in her chamber at Thornton Hall, while Mrs. Hutton fastened the last of the tiny pearl buttons that traced the length of her spine, and the woman reflected back at her was almost unrecognizable from the pale, desperate creature who had fainted into a stranger's arms at the Pemberton Spring Ball. For this woman wore a gown of midnight blue silk that shimmered like starlight when she moved, and a silver bracelet set with a grey pearl that caught the candlelight with every gesture, and an expression that hovered somewhere between terror and determination. And when Henry appeared in the doorway in his evening clothes, tall and broad-shouldered, and so impossibly handsome that her breath caught in her throat, his grey eyes travelled over her with an intensity that made her skin warm beneath the silk, and for a moment neither of them spoke until he crossed to her, and lifted her gloved hand to his lips, and murmured against her knuckles that she was magnificent, and she wanted to believe him, wanted desperately to carry that certainty with her into the glittering battlefield that awaited them. But as their carriage rolled through the summer twilight toward the Kensington estate, where the summer ball blazed with 1,000 candles, she felt the old familiar dread coiling in her stomach like a living thing, because this was not just any society event, but her first return to the world that had witnessed her complete humiliation, the world that had watched Edmund Hartley abandon her on a dance floor, and whispered behind their fans as she walked alone through a sea of pitying stares. And when she confessed as much to Henry in the darkness of the carriage, her voice barely above a whisper, he reached across the space between them and took her hand in his scarred palm warm and steady against her trembling fingers, and said simply that she was the Duchess of Thornton now, and that she should let them remember that, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice steadied her enough to lift her chin as the carriage door opened, and the music and light of the Kensington ballroom spilled out into the gathering dusk, where storm clouds were beginning to mass on the horizon, and she placed her hand on his arm and felt the solid strength of him beside her, and told herself that she could do this, that she was no longer the ruined daughter of a bankrupt gentleman, but the wife of one of the most powerful men in England. And for a time it seemed that she was right, for society was forced to acknowledge her new position with curtsies and congratulations that ranged from genuine to grudging. And when Henry led her onto the dance floor for their first waltz as husband and wife, his hand warm at her waist and his grey eyes fixed on hers with an expression that made her forget there was anyone else in the room, she felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight for 3 long years. But then the music ended, and the dancers began to disperse, and she saw him approaching through the crowd, Edmund Hartley with his golden hair and his charming smile that never reached his eyes, and his wife Viola trailing behind him with an expression of bored malice, and Eleanor's hand flew unconsciously to the hollow of her throat as Edmund stopped before them and let his gaze travel over her with insulting slowness, before declaring loudly enough for a dozen nearby guests to hear that he had always known she was clever, but he had never imagined she was quite clever enough to trap a duke with her desperation. And as the murmurs began to spread and the faces turned toward her with that terrible familiar curiosity, she felt the colour drain from her cheeks and the words die in her throat, and the old humiliation rise up to drown her, and she could not speak, could not move, could only stand frozen, while Edmund's cruel smile widened, and the moment stretched on, terrible and endless, the echo of the midsummer ball ringing in her ears as thunder rumbled in the distance. The silence that followed Edmund's words stretched like a held breath, the ballroom suspended in that terrible moment of collective anticipation, and Eleanor felt herself dissolving into the old familiar shame, felt herself becoming once again the ruined girl on the midsummer ball floor. But then Henry moved, a single step forward that somehow commanded the attention of every soul in the room, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried with the cold precision of a blade being drawn, each word deliberate and devastating as he addressed the man who had dared to insult his wife. "Hartley," he said, and the name fell like a stone into still water. "I find myself curious about the source of your confidence, given that your own circumstances are so widely known to be precarious. Your debts mounting despite your wife's fortune, your investments failed, your reputation as a fortune hunter so thoroughly established that not a single respectable family in England would permit their daughter within speaking distance of you, and yet here you stand, casting aspersions upon a woman whose worth you were too blind and too mercenary to recognize when you had the chance to claim it." Edmund's face had gone the color of old parchment, his charming smile frozen into something grotesque, and Henry continued without pause, his grey eyes cold as winter steel. "You discarded a woman of extraordinary worth for a purse, and now you dare to speak to my wife as though she should feel shame? The shame, Hartley, is entirely yours, and every person in this room knows it, just as they know that your marriage is a hollow mockery, and your prospects grow dimmer by the season, while you cling to the coat-tails of a wife who openly despises you." The silence was absolute now, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder beyond the tall windows, and Eleanor watched as Viola Hartley turned to look at her husband with an expression of such undisguised contempt that it seemed almost a kindness compared to the social execution Henry had just performed. And then Henry's arm came around Eleanor's waist, warm and solid and claiming, as he turned to address the assembled guests with that same quiet authority that brooked no argument. "My wife is the Duchess of Thornton," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the ballroom. "She is the finest woman I have ever known, and any insult to her is an insult to me, and I trust I need not explain the consequences of that." No one spoke, no one moved, and then Henry was guiding Eleanor toward the dance floor with gentle, inexorable purpose, and the orchestra, recognizing their cue with the instinct of musicians who understood the currents of power, struck up a waltz, and Eleanor found herself in her husband's arms, trembling so violently she was not certain her legs would hold her, dancing alone in the center of the floor, while 100 pairs of eyes watched, and the thunder rolled closer, and the world she had feared for 3 long years rearranged itself around her. "You did not need to do that," she whispered, her voice catching on something that might have been tears or laughter or both. "Yes," Henry said, his grey eyes fierce on hers with an intensity that stole what remained of her breath. "I did." And as other couples began to join them on the floor, as society reorganized itself around this new reality in which the Duchess of Thornton was not to be trifled with, Eleanor looked up at the man who had just defended her honor before all the world, and felt the last of her careful walls crumble into dust, because this was not protection born of duty or respect offered from obligation. This was something far more terrifying and wonderful, and though neither of them had spoken the words, she knew with sudden blazing certainty that she was not the only one who had broken their vow. The carriage jolted into motion as the first true fury of the storm broke over them, rain lashing against the windows with such violence that the world beyond became nothing but streaks of water and darkness. And inside this small enclosed space that smelled of sandalwood and cedar and the lingering dampness of the summer night, Eleanor found herself unable to maintain the composure she had clung to so desperately on the dance floor, her whole body beginning to tremble with the force of everything she had suppressed, while 100 pairs of eyes watched her waltz in the arms of a man who had just dismantled her tormentor before all of society. And when she tried to speak, her voice broke on the first word, a sound somewhere between gratitude and grief that seemed to startle them both in the intimate darkness. "What you did," she managed, pressing her gloved fingers to her lips, as though she could hold back the flood of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "What you said to him, I cannot. You must understand that no one has ever—" But she could not finish, could not find words adequate to express what it had meant to watch someone stand between her and her shame, to hear her worth proclaimed in a voice that permitted no argument. And she saw his scarred hand clench against his thigh in that gesture she had come to know so well, the gesture that meant he was fighting something he did not know how to express. And when he spoke, his voice was gruff with discomfort. "It was nothing more than the truth," he said, turning his face toward the rain-streaked window, as though the storm outside was easier to face than whatever he saw in her eyes. Any man would have done the same. But Eleanor shook her head, emboldened by the darkness and the intimacy and the wild, reckless hope that was beating against her ribs like a caged bird. And she asked the question that had been burning in her chest since the moment he had stepped forward in that ballroom, asked him why he had truly done it. Not the reason he would give society, but the reason that lived beneath his careful walls. And the silence that followed, stretched so long she thought he would not answer at all, until he drew a breath that seemed to cost him something and said, "Because you are worth defending. Because no one should speak to you that way. Because—" And then he stopped, his jaw tightening, his hand clenching so hard she could see the white of his knuckles even in the dim carriage light. And he could not finish, could not say whatever word hovered on the edge of his tongue. But Eleanor saw the truth in his grey eyes when he finally turned to look at her, saw something fierce and frightened and achingly tender that matched the impossible feeling swelling in her own chest. And neither of them spoke again, until the carriage rolled to a stop before Thornton Hall, and they hurried through the rain into the entrance hall, where servants waited with candles and concerned murmurs about the storm. And Eleanor thought the moment had passed, thought they would retreat to their separate chambers and their separate silences as they had done every night for 10 weeks. But then his hand caught hers as she turned toward the stairs, his fingers warm and slightly unsteady against her own. And when she looked back at him, his expression was stripped of every defense he had ever built, raw and vulnerable and so beautiful, it made her heart ache. "Eleanor," he said, and the sound of her Christian name in his voice, spoken for the first time without title or formality, was like a key turning in a lock she had not known was closed. "I meant every word." He lifted her hand to his lips with a tenderness that belied the strength of his grip, pressed a kiss to her knuckles that burned through the silk of her glove, and then released her and walked away toward his own chambers without looking back. And Eleanor stood alone in the candle-lit hallway, with her hand pressed to her heart, and her whole body trembling with a hope so fierce and so terrifying that she could scarcely breathe, because she understood now that his vow of protection and respect had been a lie, not in its promise but in its limitation, and whatever existed between them had already grown into something far more dangerous and wonderful than either of them had intended. The week that followed, the Kensington ball, passed in a kind of exquisite agony that Eleanor could neither escape nor bring herself to end, for everything had changed between them, and yet nothing had changed at all, their routines continuing with the same outward rhythm of breakfast conversations and evening readings and quiet walks through the summer gardens, while beneath the surface something vast and unspoken trembled like heat lightning on the horizon, and she found herself acutely aware of his presence in ways that bordered on torment. The way his hand brushed hers when he passed her a book in the library, sending sparks racing up her arm. The way she would look up from her embroidery to find his grey eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs and set her heart hammering against her ribs. The way he said her name now with that low, rough tenderness that made her think of the kiss he had pressed to her knuckles and the fierce declaration that had silenced a ballroom. And Lady Beatrice observed it all with the knowing satisfaction of a woman whose predictions were coming true before her very eyes, her sharp gaze moving between them at dinner with barely concealed delight, while Mrs. Hutton found excuses to linger in doorways and smile her quiet, motherly smile at the transformation unfolding in the house she had served for 30 years. It was on the 5th day of this sweet torture that Eleanor found herself alone in the library, reaching for a volume of poetry on the highest shelf she could access. And her fingers closed instead upon a worn leather binding that she did not recognize, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets so well read that the spine cracked when she opened it, and her breath caught in her throat when she saw the marginalia. The careful notations in her hand she had come to know from estate documents and correspondence, Henry's precise script marking passages with dates and observations, and when she turned to Sonnet 116, she found the entire poem underlined with a date written beside it that made her knees go weak, a date that preceded their wedding by 3 days, and the words seemed to blur before her eyes as she read them again and again. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. And she pressed the book to her chest, and wondered if he had meant her to find it. Wondered what it meant that he had marked these words before he had even spoken his vows, and the wondering was almost more than she could bear. She was still standing there, clutching the sonnets like a lifeline, when Lady Beatrice found her, and something in Eleanor's expression must have betrayed the tumult within, because the older woman crossed to her immediately, and took her hands with a gentleness that undid the last of Eleanor's composure, and the words spilled out before she could stop them. The admission that she loved him so desperately it terrified her, that she was afraid this would always be an arrangement to him, that she had broken her vow never to believe in love, and now she stood on the precipice of having her heart shattered once more, and Lady Beatrice listened with those sharp, knowing eyes softening into something like tender amusement before she squeezed Eleanor's trembling fingers and said, "My dear girl, my nephew has been in love with you since the moment you fainted into his arms. He simply has no idea how to say it, but I have watched him build walls for 20 years, and I have never seen anyone bring them down the way you do. So you must be patient with him, and brave enough for both of you, because he will find the words eventually. And when he does, I suspect they will be worth the waiting." 2 days had passed since Lady Beatrice's words had planted themselves in Eleanor's heart like seeds that would not stop growing. 2 days of watching and waiting and feeling the weight of unspoken truth pressing against her chest until she thought she might shatter from the force of it. And on the morning of the 3rd day she woke to a sky the colour of bruised plums, and a restlessness in her blood that would not be quieted by embroidery or reading or any of the gentle occupations that had once brought her peace, and she knew with a certainty that settled into her bones like the ache before a storm that she could bear the uncertainty no longer, that she must speak or be consumed by the speaking she had left undone. And so, when Mrs. Hutton came to help her dress, selecting a gown of soft dove-grey that matched the gathering clouds beyond the window, Eleanor found herself asking questions she had never dared to ask before. Questions about the boy Henry had been, before grief had taught him to build his fortress walls, and the housekeeper's weathered hands stilled on the buttons at Eleanor's back as her eyes grew distant with memory. "He was the sweetest child," Mrs. Hutton said softly, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years of watching and hoping. always bringing me flowers from the garden, always wanting to know if the kitchen maids were happy, if the stable boys had enough to eat, and when his mother died, something in him went quiet, and when his father turned cold, something in him closed like a door being locked from the inside. And I have prayed every night for 20 years that someone would come along brave enough to reach him, someone who would not give up when he pushed them away. She met Eleanor's eyes in the mirror with an intensity that made Eleanor's breath catch. He needs someone who will not give up, Your Grace, and I believe you are that someone, if you will only trust yourself enough to try. Eleanor descended the stairs with Mrs. Hutton's words echoing in her heart, determined to find Henry and speak the truth that burned in her chest, but the footman informed her that his Grace had ridden out at dawn to inspect storm damage on the far reaches of the estate, and was not expected to return until evening, and so she was left to wait with the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, and the air growing heavy and electric with the promise of rain, and she paced the morning room until she could pace no longer, her hand rising again and again to the hollow of her throat, where the silver bracelet now rested against her pulse, the grey pearl warm from her skin, and finally her restless feet carried her to the conservatory, where the white camellias bloomed in glorious profusion, their scent rising to meet her like an embrace as she pushed open the glass door and stepped into the humid warmth. And she stood among the flowers he had planted for her, the flowers that meant he had been listening when she thought no one heard. And she touched the velvet petals with trembling fingers, and knew with absolute certainty that this was where she would tell him, here among the blooms that proved he had loved her, before either of them had known the word for what grew between them. And she would wait for him here, wait for as long as it took, because some truths were worth any amount of waiting, and some loves were worth any amount of risk. The storm broke with a fury that seemed to mirror the tempest in Eleanor's heart. Rain hammering against the glass roof of the conservatory, in sheets so thick that the world beyond became nothing but silver and shadow, and she stood among the white camellias, with her hands pressed to her chest, and her pulse racing as lightning split the darkening sky and illuminated the blooms around her in brilliant flashes that made them glow like pale ghosts. And she had been waiting for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than one, the scent of the flowers rising around her in waves that mingled with the electric charge of the storm, until she could hardly breathe for the weight of anticipation pressing against her ribs. And then she heard it, the sound of the conservatory door being thrown open, and she turned to find him, standing there in the doorway with rain streaming from his dark hair, and his riding clothes soaked through and clinging to the broad shoulders she had memorized in stolen glances across breakfast tables and candle-lit dinners. And his grey eyes found hers across the humid space with an intensity that made her knees threaten to buckle. And he said her name, just her name, Eleanor, in that low, rough voice that had haunted her dreams. And then he was moving toward her through the camellias, heedless of the water he dripped across the flagstones, saying, "I had to find you. I rode back through the storm, because I could not bear another hour of not telling you." And she could not speak, could only watch him approach with her heart in her, throat and tears already burning behind her eyes. And when he stopped before her, close enough that she could smell the rain on his skin mingling with that beloved scent of sandalwood and cedar, his scarred hand was trembling at his side as he struggled to find words that had clearly been building in him for months. "Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds," he said, his voice breaking on the familiar words. "I marked that sonnet 3 days before our wedding, because I knew even then, Eleanor, I knew what you were to me, even when I told myself this was merely an arrangement, and I have been a coward, the worst kind of coward, because I made you a vow that I would give you protection and respect and my name, and that I did not know if I was capable of more, but that was a lie. Not the protection or the respect, but the rest of it, because I am capable of so much more. I am capable of everything. I love you, Eleanor. I have loved you since you stood in my arms at that wretched ball, and looked at me with those grey-green eyes like a winter sea. And I have been too afraid to tell you, because loving someone gives the world a weapon against you, and I have spent 20 years making certain no one would ever have that power over me again. But you have it. You have had it since the beginning, and I cannot pretend otherwise for one more moment." The tears were streaming down her cheeks now, and she reached up to touch his face with fingers that shook, and she said, "I broke my vow too. The vow I made never to believe in love again. I broke it for you. I love you, Henry. I love you so much. It terrifies me. And I am grateful and overwhelmed, and I do not have words grand enough for what I feel." And his hands came up to cradle her face, those large, gentle hands that she had watched comfort a lost child and clench against emotion and reach for her in the darkness of a carriage. And he kissed her, finally, at last, his lips soft and reverent against hers as the thunder rolled overhead and the lightning flashed through the glass, and the scent of camellias surrounded them like a blessing. And when they broke apart, breathless and trembling, she saw through the rain-streaked glass that the storm was breaking, golden light spilling through the clouds, as if the heavens themselves were acknowledging what had finally been spoken aloud. They remained in the conservatory as the storm retreated across the hills, the violence of the rain softening to a gentle patter, and then to silence, and the clouds parted to reveal the first trembling stars of evening, while Eleanor stood in the circle of Henry's arms, with her cheek pressed against his damp chest, and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. And they talked as they had never talked before, words spilling from them like water finally released from a dam. And he told her about the morning after their wedding, when he had clasped the silver bracelet around her wrist, how he had commissioned it the very day he proposed, because even then he had known she deserved something beautiful, something that would rest against her pulse and remind her that someone had noticed the color of her eyes. And she wept again at this confession, at the realization that he had been loving her in his quiet way from the very beginning, while she had been too wounded to see it. And she told him that he was everything she had never dared to hope for, that she had armored herself against dreams of love, only to find that love had slipped past her defenses in the form of a stern duke who planted flowers she had mentioned once and caught her when she fell and defended her honor before all of society. And his arms tightened around her as she spoke. And when the stars had fully emerged and the conservatory had grown cool with the passing of the storm, he took her hand and led her through the quiet house where the candles had been lit against the darkness and the servants had discreetly vanished, and they climbed the stairs together in a silence that trembled with anticipation. And when they reached the door of her chambers he stopped, his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, and he said in that low, rough voice that had become the sound of safety itself, "I will not presume, Eleanor, this must be your choice." And she looked up at this man who had given her protection and respect, and his name and so much more. This man who had broken down his fortress walls for her. And she took his scarred hand in both of hers and drew him across the threshold, saying, "You are my choice, Henry. You have been my choice since you caught me when I fell." And the door closed behind them, and the stars wheeled slowly past the window as they came together at last, tender and passionate and reverent, his hands trembling as they learned the geography of her skin, her fingers tracing the scar across his palm that had once clenched against feeling, and now lay open and relaxed against the small of her back. And when it was over, and they lay tangled together in the silver starlight with his scent of sandalwood and cedar surrounding her like a benediction, he whispered her name against her hair, "Eleanor, my Eleanor." And she knew that she had found at last the home she had been searching for, not in the grand halls of Thornton, or the modest parlour of her girlhood, but here in the arms of a man who had chosen her, who would always choose her, whose love had been patient enough to wait until she was brave enough to reach for it. 2 weeks had passed since the storm that had broken both the summer sky and the walls around their hearts, and Thornton Hall had transformed into something Eleanor would not have recognized on that first anxious afternoon when she had arrived as a bride in name only. For now the great stone house seemed to breathe with warmth and laughter, the very air softened by the change that had come over its master, and she watched him across the breakfast table on this golden morning, as he smiled at something Lady Beatrice said, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his grey eyes and made him look younger than his years, and his hand rested on Eleanor's wrist as it so often did now, his thumb tracing absent circles over the silver bracelet with its grey pearl that caught the morning light, and Mrs. Hutton moved through the room with tears perpetually threatening at the corners of her eyes, exchanging glances with the footmen and the maids, who had all noticed how their stern duke had become a man transformed, how he laughed openly and touched his wife constantly, and looked at her as though she had hung the very stars he had whispered her name beneath. And when Mr. Thomas Ashworth arrived that afternoon to see his daughter before the evening's grand gala, he stood in the doorway of the drawing-room and watched Henry press a kiss to Eleanor's temple while she reviewed the seating arrangements, and the old man's eyes filled with tears that spilled down his weathered cheeks as he said in a voice thick with emotion, "I have given you nothing but trouble, my dear girl, but God has given you this, and I am grateful beyond words." And Eleanor embraced her father, while Henry stood by with his scarred hand relaxed at his side, no longer clenched against feeling, but open and ready to reach for her, as it always was now. Lady Beatrice surveyed the scene from her chair by the window with the satisfaction of a woman whose predictions had come gloriously true, declaring to Mrs. Hutton, "I told you, Clara, that girl would be the unmaking of all his careful walls, and look at him now, look at them both." And Mrs. Hutton could only nod and dab at her eyes with her handkerchief, her 20 years of prayers answered in the radiant happiness that filled every corner of the house. The gala itself was a triumph beyond anything society had witnessed in a generation, the great ballroom of Thornton Hall blazing with 1,000 candles that reflected off crystal chandeliers, and the jewels adorning the necks of every important family in the county. And Eleanor descended the grand staircase in a gown of deep grey-green silk that matched her eyes exactly, the silver bracelet glinting at her wrist, her chestnut hair swept up to reveal the graceful column of her neck, and the small beauty mark below her left cheekbone that Henry had traced with his thumb just an hour before, while telling her she was the most beautiful woman in England, and she moved through the crowd on his arm with her shoulders straight and her chin level, no longer the posture of a woman refusing to be pitied, but the carriage of a woman who knew herself beloved. And the whispers that followed her now were not of scandal or ruin, but of admiration and envy. "Look how he watches her," they murmured. "Look how she glows. They say it was an arrangement, but no one could look at them and believe it." And Eleanor heard every word and smiled, her hand resting on Henry's arm as he guided her through the throng with his palm warm against the small of her back, positioning himself always between her and any potential slight, though none came now, for society had recognized what she had become and bowed before it. Edmund Hartley stood near the refreshment table with Viola on his arm, his golden hair less lustrous than it had been 3 years ago, his handsome face grown bitter around the edges, and he watched Eleanor pass with an expression that mingled envy and regret in equal measure, forced to attend by the social consequence of refusing an invitation from the Duke of Thornton, forced to witness the woman he had discarded as damaged goods, now reigning as the undisputed queen of the evening. And when Viola approached Eleanor near the terrace doors with that brittle smile and those cold eyes, saying in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "How charming that you have managed to make something of yourself after all. though I suppose even a fallen woman can rise if she finds a wealthy enough protector." Eleanor did not flinch, did not feel the old shame rising, but simply looked at the beautiful, bitter woman before her with something that surprised them both, genuine pity, and she said softly, "I hope you find happiness some day, Lady Hartley. It is quite wonderful." And she turned and walked away on Henry's arm, leaving Viola speechless and pale, and Henry's hand tightened on hers as he murmured, "That was magnificently done." And she looked up at him, at this man who had defended her honor and planted her flowers and broken down his fortress walls to let her in, and she said, "I find I have nothing left to prove to anyone but you." And his grey eyes, warm as storm clouds breaking into sunlight, met hers with such love that several nearby matrons sighed audibly, and Eleanor knew that the girl who had stood frozen with humiliation on a ballroom floor 3 years ago was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had learned that love was not the absence of fear, but the courage to hope anyway. And as the orchestra began to play, and Henry led her onto the dance floor for the first waltz, she rested her head briefly against his shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for catching me when I fell." And he pressed his lips to her hair and whispered back, "Thank you for teaching me how to love." And they danced beneath the glittering chandeliers, while society watched and whispered and wondered at the transformation of the cold Duke of Thornton, not knowing that the true miracle was not his transformation at all, but the quiet courage of a woman who had dared to believe in love again. 5 years had passed since the storm that had changed everything. 5 years of mornings waking in his arms, and evenings reading together in the library, and nights whispered with promises kept and exceeded. And on this golden autumn afternoon, Eleanor stood at the nursery window, with her hand resting on the sill, where the late sunlight pooled like honey, watching the scene unfolding in the garden below, with a heart so full she thought it might overflow, for there on the grass still green, despite the turning season, was Henry, the Duke of Thornton, on his knees in the dirt, with his fine coat abandoned on a nearby bench, and his shirt-sleeves rolled to his elbows, and their son William, 4 years old, with his father's grey eyes and serious brow, was attempting to teach him the proper way to examine a beetle, while their daughter Rose, barely 2, with her mother's chestnut curls escaping from her ribbons, sat on his back as though he were a horse, and shrieked with delighted laughter every time he pretended to buck. And the sound of that laughter, both the children's bright peals and Henry's deep rumble beneath them, rose through the autumn air like music, and Eleanor pressed her fingers to her lips to contain the emotion that threatened to spill from her eyes, remembering the stern, cold man who had caught her when she fainted at a ball, the man who had clenched his scarred hand against feeling, the man who had believed himself incapable of more than protection and respect. And here he was now crawling through the grass with a beetle in his palm and a daughter on his back, and joy written across every line of his face. Behind her the nursery door opened and Lady Beatrice entered, older now, her hair gone fully silver, but her eyes as sharp as ever, and she came to stand beside Eleanor at the window and watched the scene below with satisfaction evident in every feature, saying, "I told Clara Hutton the day you arrived that you would be the unmaking of all his walls, and look at him now, look at what you have made of him." And Eleanor shook her head gently. "I only loved him. He did the rest himself." But Lady Beatrice snorted in that inelegant way she had. "Nonsense, child. You taught him that love was safe, and that is no small thing." In the library, Mr. Thomas Ashworth sat in a chair by the fire with young William on his knee, for the children had been brought in from the garden as the air grew cool, and he read to his grandson from a book of fairy tales, while Rose drowsed against Mrs. Hutton's shoulder, and the housekeeper's eyes were bright with the tears that came so easily to her now, her 20 years of prayers answered beyond anything she had dared to imagine. And when Henry entered the room with grass stains on his trousers, and his hair dishevelled and his face alight with the simple joy of fatherhood, she whispered to no one in particular, He was a sweet lad before the world taught him to be hard, and now he is sweet again. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Eleanor and Henry walked through the gardens hand in hand, their children asleep in the nursery and the house glowing warm behind them. And when they reached the conservatory where the white camellias still bloomed in profusion, filling the air with their delicate scent, he stopped and turned to her and took both her hands in his scarred palm open and warm against her fingers, and he said in that low voice that had become the sound of home, "I made you a vow once, Eleanor, that I would give you protection and respect and my name, and that I did not know if I was capable of more." And she watched his grey eyes, soft now in the fading light, as he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I was wrong. I was capable of so much more. I was capable of everything. You taught me that." And she stepped into his arms and laid her head against his chest, where his heart beat steady and sure. And she said, "You taught me to believe in love again, and that is everything." And they stood among the camellias as the first stars appeared, two people who had found in each other not just safety or respect or even passion, but the complete and perfect fulfillment of every hope they had been too wounded to dream. Late that night, when the children were long asleep and the house had settled into its quiet evening rhythms, Eleanor found herself drawn to the library by the soft glow of lamplight spilling beneath the door, and when she entered she discovered Henry in his favourite chair by the fire, with the worn volume of Shakespeare's sonnets open in his hands, the same volume she had found years ago with passages marked in his careful script. And he looked up at her approach with that smile that still made her heart stutter after 5 years of marriage and 2 children and countless mornings waking in his arms. And he extended his hand to her in silent invitation, and she went to him as she always did, curling against his side in the wide chair with her head resting on his shoulder, and the scent of sandalwood and cedar wrapping around her like the embrace of home itself. And he began to read aloud in that deep voice that rumbled through his chest and into her very bones. "Let me, not to the marriage of true minds, admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove." And Eleanor joined him for the final lines, their voices twining together in the firelit room. "If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved." And when the words faded into the crackle of flames and the soft tick of the grandfather clock, they sat in comfortable silence with his scarred hand open and relaxed against her back. And Eleanor thought of the journey that had brought her here, from the shattered woman who had stood frozen with humiliation on a ballroom floor, to the beloved Duchess, who now wore a silver bracelet set with a grey pearl, and walked through life on the arm of a man who had planted white camellias simply because she had mentioned once that her mother loved them, and she remembered her vow never to believe in love again, that desperate promise made in the ashes of Edmund Hartley's cruelty, and she was grateful beyond words that she had broken it, grateful for Lady Beatrice's sharp wisdom and Mrs. Hutton's faithful prayers, and her father's gentle hope, grateful most of all for her own courage in reaching for a man who had hidden behind fortress walls for 20 years. And she understood now what she could not have known then, that love was not the absence of fear, but the choice to hope anyway, not the guarantee of safety, but the willingness to be vulnerable, not the certainty of happy endings, but the courage to begin. And as Henry pressed a kiss to her hair, and whispered her name like a prayer as he always did, Eleanor sent a silent thought outward to anyone who might be listening to her story, anyone who had ever stood shattered on their own ballroom floor, anyone who had vowed never to believe again. And she wished them the courage to break that vow, the wisdom to recognize love when it caught them in steady arms, the patience to let trust build slowly through small gestures and quiet moments, because the greatest loves, she had learned, were not the ones that blazed brightest at first sight, but the ones that grew from respect into trust, into passion, into the complete and perfect fulfillment of every hope. And if her story had given anyone the courage to believe that such love was possible, then every moment of heartbreak had been worth the journey to this library, this fire, this man, this life. And Eleanor closed her eyes against Henry's shoulder and smiled, content in the knowledge that some stories do not merely end happily, but continue happily, day after day, year after year, love after love, forever.